Welcome back to Conversation with the Candidate and our guest, Democratic candidate for president, Marianne Williamson. We're going to go into our town hall format now, where we have our New Hampshire voters here ready with their questions. And the first question tonight will be coming from Erin Motto.
This country is very politically polarized, trading right and wrong for left and right. What would you do to change this?
I think that you don't change other people, you change yourself. And I am very clear, and I think all of us need to remember that the foundational principle of this country is unity in diversity. Out of many, one. I think we all need to take a deep breath and remember that none of us have a monopoly on truth. Other people do not owe it to you to agree with you. There are high-minded conservative principles and there are high-minded liberal principles. We need a consensus of people of goodwill who know that. I think a smug, self-righteous, intolerant left-winger is no more or less dangerous to the emotional fabric of this country than a smug, self-righteous, intolerant right-winger. We need people to take a deep breath, to know that none of us, as I said, have a monopoly on truth. Other people, whether they agree with you or not, have values as well and care about life as you do. And when we find that center within ourselves, then we acknowledge that place in other people. It's a change in our own hearts that has to happen in order for us to reclaim the public discourse of honor and goodness. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. The next question comes from Kathleen Hoey of Manchester.
Hi, how are you?
Thank you.
So I'm asking a prescription drug question. How would you address the high cost of prescription drugs so people can get the treatment they need without sacrificing their basic needs?
I think that the power of big pharma is obscene in this country, whether it has to do with the oil companies, military industrial contractors, health insurance companies, or big pharma. We have a corporatocracy in this country. We have become a veiled aristocratic system. That is what we repudiated in 1776, and we need to repudiate it again. This is the American Revolution, in that sense, is an ongoing process. The U.S. government should not be a subservient to big pharma. The U.S. government should not be an advocate for short-term profits for big pharma. The United States government should be an advocate for the people of the United States.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. Our next question comes from social media on Instagram. User RobWills64. He asks, with women's equality forefront in our society, do you support women registering for the draft upon their 18th birthday, just like men?
I would have to say yes.
Expound a little bit. I think. Do you think women belong in combat situations?
I think women belong in whatever situations in the military that they would wish to be in.
Okay. Next question comes from Benjamin Pelletier.
Hello. Since the start of the Cold War, the United States has repeatedly tried to, or did get involved in conflicts throughout the world. Will you continue this strategy as president?
Since World War II. You know, before World War II, we didn't even have a standing army. I think we'd all agree that a standing army is necessary. And I certainly have great respect for the U.S. military, and I think we all should and do. But I see the military like you see a surgeon. If you want to have surgery, we need to have the best surgeon. There's no doubt about that. But we should avoid surgery at all costs when we can, of course. So yes, I think the military has been used irresponsibly, obviously. It has been used irresponsibly in Iraq. We know that it was used irresponsibly in Vietnam and in other places as well. So while I would not hesitate to use force in situations where the security of the United States and the values that we uphold are at risk, I believe, yes, that it is without a doubt true. And not only obvious to us here in America, but unfortunately obvious to many people around the world for whom the moral authority, the global moral authority of the United States has been so compromised that we have become bullies militarily, tried to use brute force when far too often love and soul force and brotherhood and justice and humanitarian issues and a true championship for democracy would have been the way to lead as a country.
So you believe the war in Iraq and Vietnam are examples of irresponsible military leadership. Can you name an example of what you would consider responsible military intervention by the U.S. since Vietnam?
Oh, since Vietnam? I don't know about, of course I was going to say World War II. You know, Afghanistan is not an easy one. I have ambivalence about Afghanistan. So I think Afghanistan is not cut and dried the way something like the Iraq War is, where we invaded a country that had done nothing to us, that had nothing to do with 9/11. in which there was no al-Qaeda. And to be honest, even if they had had weapons of mass destruction, the truth is that the United States does business with countries that have weapons of mass destruction every single day. And I think that this is an example of a case where the American people cannot farm out our conscience and cannot farm out some of these political decisions. We, the American people, can only reclaim the power of the American people if we ourselves realize that there is a responsibility to citizenship. The problem for me is not just that we invaded Iraq, but that we, the American people, did not question it as deeply as we should have. The media did not question it as deeply as we should have. And I think if we had all been asking ourselves much more meaningful questions about that, the U.S. government would not have felt so free to take such reckless action.
And what would the Defense Department budget look like under a President Williamson?
Well, even President Bush's Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, said that we must learn to wage peace. General Mattis said before he left the Department of Defense that if you're not going to fully fund the State Department, he said, I'm going to have to buy more ammunition. We must wage peace. You can't just fight sickness, you have to cultivate health. And you can't just always be preparing for war, you also have to equally wage peace. You wage peace by expanding economic opportunities for women, and these are statistically, sociologically certain facts. In a situation where there is greater economic opportunity for women, greater educational opportunity for children, reduced violence against women, and an amelioration of human suffering, unnecessary human suffering whenever possible, there is a reduction of violence. But for every dollar that the United States spends on peace creation, we spend over $1,000 on the military. And that is not the way to provide for peace for our children 50 years from now or 100 years from now. Our national defense strategy, and once again, this is not a critique of the military, this is of the political decisions made. Our national defense strategy has to do with preparing for war. It has nothing to do, hardly anything to do, I won't say it has nothing to do, but it has far too little to do with actually creating and paving a way to peace. In my administration, there would be a far more robust peace creation, far more funding, far more partnership, equal partnership between the Defense Department and the State Department in order that humanitarian and diplomatic efforts that truly do wage peace would be a hallmark of American foreign policy.
Okay, one more social media question before we get back to the town hall. Carol Fontaine asks, how would you address the ballooning national debt and the inevitable financial crisis it will cause?
Well, the ballooning national debt, you know, I believe in investing in people. And I believe that what we need is more productivity and more creativity among the American people. The more creativity and productivity you have among the American people, the more capacity you have to address the debt. But we keep behaving in ways, whether it has to do with the high cost of medicine, whether it has to do with the high cost of college, whether it has to do with so many of the ways that we actually support companies in making it harder for people to be productive and creative. So I believe in investing in education, investing in people, investing in opportunities. We do need a version of a Green New Deal. And to be honest, with what's coming with automation, the United States should be having a serious conversation about universal basic income, federal jobs guarantee, or some mix thereof. We have a tsunami coming to this country, and it could cause massive human devastation.
Okay, next question comes from Stephen Kidder of Concord.
Howdy, thank you so much for taking my question.
Thank you.
My name is Stephen. I'm an ACLU voter, which means I prioritize civil liberties when I cast my ballot. And an issue that's important to me is LGBTQ+ rights. And I want to know, will you do federally what we are in the process of doing locally in New Hampshire, which is federally recognized a third gender marker on IDs?
A
Third gender marker on IDs.
Tell me why that would increase your civil liberties, please.
So therefore people can live authentically and not live and not have to abide by binary that does not abide by them.
I believe that the principle that God gave inalienable rights to all people, to life and to liberty and the pursuit of happiness. You're being gay, or you're being transgender, or you're being whatever you are, is the way you pursue happiness. And it is the function of government, our Declaration of Independence says, to secure those rights. If that increases your capacity to live in a way that pursues your happiness, then go for it. That's what America should be.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And we'll get you a little water here, Ms. Williamson.
Thank you.
Sounds like you're a little parched, but let's get to another social media question.
Sorry.
We're going to get one here from
Thank you.
Douglas Hanson. He asks, what are your plans to address gun violence in America?
Gun violence in America, like so many of our problems, is multidimensional. Some of the problems, and this is why we have to take a holistic, integrative approach. Some of the problems are external, and some of the problems are internal. A lot of the violence in America is the violence in our own hearts, and we do have to address that. At the same time, I believe that just like we were talking about the health insurance companies, just like we were talking about Big Pharma, just like we were talking about oil companies, just like we were talking about military-industrial complex, we also know that when it comes to gun manufacturers in the United States and their lobbying arm, the NRA, the American government has done more to advocate for their short-term profits than to advocate for the safety of the American people. I agree with the majority of American people who want these universal, to close these loopholes and these universal background checks. The American people want to outlaw the bump stocks. And I think we should have a very serious conversation about the issue of assault rifles. I do not believe that a military assault rifle should be in the hands of an average citizen. On the other hand, ladies and gentlemen, at the same time, even though those things are important, and I would be definitely on the side of all legislative and all presidential effort to make sure that those things come to pass, fighting off the undue influence of the NRA. At the same time, we're adults. We know what's going on in this country, and we know how many guns are already in the hands of people. We know that the violence has to begin with the peacemaking efforts inside our own hearts. We need more compassion for each other. We need more forgiveness of each other. We need to address the issue of violence inside as well as outside, and until we do, we will have an increasing problem in this country.
Another question coming from Jerome Horwitz. He asks, what is your stance on illegal immigration and border security?
I believe that a terrible disservice has been done, not only to many people who are immigrants, but to the foundational principles of this country. George Bush, a Republican president, spoke out just in the last couple of days about the value and the importance of immigration. I'm an immigration lawyer's daughter. I'm an immigration lawyer's sister. I grew up going to the ceremonies where immigrants are given the opportunity to become citizens. The truth of the matter, what I saw as a child is true. The average immigrant, in order to become a citizen of the United States, has to study more American civics, more American government, knows more about our Declaration of Independence, and knows more about our constitutional principles than we do. They're the ones sometimes who are exhibiting, they're the lifeblood, and this has always been true, coming to a new country in order to have a better life. That's America. That is our characterological DNA. We want better for ourselves. We want better for our children. And when people like our grandparents and our great-grandparents, unless you're a descendant of a slave or the descendant of a Native American whose people were here for thousands of years before the European settlers came, this is what our grandparents came here to do. All four of my grandparents came here from Russia for a better life and made it here. So I feel that value, that democratic value, it must be protected at all costs. We did not have a problem, ladies and gentlemen. This problem was made up. We have some issues that we have to handle, but border security, the main issues of border security are at our ports. The main issues of border security have to do with what might be coming in with submarines. The real issues of border security have to do with much more serious things than just some poor woman trying to get over here with her child. That has to do with, even some experts would argue, with the possibilities of nuclear bombs. That's where we should be putting our border security efforts, our border security money. This is a terrible illusion and canard that has been created, this anti-immigrant fervor, this demonization of immigrants. And I hope that when this unfortunate episode of American history comes to a close, that we, the American people, will reclaim the goodness of our honor of the immigrants who seek a better life here.
This social media question coming in from Steve Merrill. He asks, when do we, the people, get the same insurance coverage that people working for us receive, i.e. members of Congress?
Isn't that the truth? Isn't that the truth? We all know this. I see this election in so many ways. That's just one way in which the American people need to admit what we know to be true. And that's the unfairness of this system, the injustice of this system. And we have to rise up. And that's what elections are for. There has to be a massive rising up of the consciousness of the American people and the marches that we have to take to the polls. That's a perfect example. The fact that the same Congress that will not give us universal health care and make sure that their health care is just fine. We need to reclaim our capacity to guffaw and to say, that stops now.
Our next question comes from Jan Pendlebury.
Welcome to New Hampshire, Ms. Williamson.
Thank you.
If elected president, what is your plan to remove the influence of the pharmaceutical industry in health care?
I believe that we should have universal health care. I believe that the U.S. government should be able to negotiate for better prices. It is outrageous. And as I already said, the fact that we know whatever the insurance companies want, whatever Big Pharma wants, that stops when I'm president.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. And Ms. Williamson, you're someone who's done a lot of writing about how to help people and how to help them improve their lives. Part of being in politics is sometimes you don't have all the answers. So I'm curious, of all the teachings that you provided to people over the years, do you think there's anything that just doesn't apply in the world of politics, that wouldn't work if you're in the White House?
I think quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. The things that I've written about and talked about for 35 years need to be brought into politics. We're here to love each other. And when you forget that, things fall into chaos. And that is as true of a nation as it is of an individual. All that a nation is a group of people. So the same spiritual and moral principles that prevail within the life of an individual prevail within the life of a nation. And that includes, love includes radical honesty with oneself, admitting your own character defects, admitting where you haven't been who you say you are. And that's why I feel that I'm uniquely qualified to help navigate these times, because I feel that I can, along with the American people, with love for this country, take a deep look. Where are we not now who we say we are? Where are we not standing on the principles that we purport to believe in? Where are we not now a government of the people, by the people, and for the people? Where do we have things we need to atone for? Where do we have amends that we need to make? You can't heal your life, ladies and gentlemen, without getting straight with the God of your understanding, and neither can a nation. And Abraham Lincoln said that, other presidents have said that. And the fact that we are leaving out the moral and spiritual principles of human life and transformation, that's what's wrong with our politics today. I'd be bringing them in.
How would those principles apply if you're sitting across a negotiating table from someone like Kim Jong-un, who executes his own people by feeding them to dogs?
Kim Jong-un represents a situation where, some sicknesses, some diseases you can cure, and others you have to manage. And Kim Jong-un is more like something that needs to be managed. There is no specific cure. We have to manage it very carefully. I have great respect for the international experts within our intelligence agencies who are well aware of all the vicissitudes of that relationship. I would, unlike our current president, do a lot of listening to the American intelligence agencies, and would, to the best of my abilities, I'm sure any responsible president would, seek to manage that condition, that situation in such a way as to secure the safety of the American people.
And do you still think you would write any books in the White House?
I would be very busy. I would be working for you at that point.
Okay, Marianne Williamson, thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
We're going to continue this conversation
Thank you so
online
much.
and on our mobile app. We'll have more questions from our town hall audience and from social media, and I might mix in a few myself. But for our TV audience, if you can, jump over to online or on our mobile app. But you can join us next week when we'll have Bill Weld, the former governor of Massachusetts, for conversation with the candidate. Until then, we'll see you, but jump on over to online and on our mobile app, and we'll see you there for more of conversation with the candidate. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.